Welcome everybody to the library tonight. I'd like to thank the Brattleboro Historical Society, especially John and Mary Carnahan, for co-sponsoring and hosting Lynn tonight. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Marilyn Blackwell. She's an independent scholar who has published widely on women's and Vermont history. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of the Vermont Historical Society's Vermont History, Journal of Women's History, and the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. And it seems to me appropriate that we should be having a talk this evening on this great 19th century Brattleboro pioneer of women's rights during Women's History Month, and after the death last weekend of a modern advocate for women's political rights, Geraldine Ferraro. So I'd like to please welcome Dr. Black.
I guess some of you know that I've just come out with a new biography of Clarina Nichols. And it's not the first time I've been in Brattleboro. I was here to talk about all of my Brattleboro history topics. I began with Mary Tyler, and then I did work on the Thompson Trust. I did my dissertation on the women of the Thompson Trust. And then I discovered Clarina Nichols, who was the great lady editress of Brattleboro. So I've been here before to talk about her, and as you can imagine, in doing a biography, you come up with a whole slew of different stories. So there's lots of choices tonight. What I decided to do was to talk about her time during the pre-Civil War period. That's a story that really hasn't been told much in Vermont. And in fact, when I first started studying Nichols, I discovered that all of the Vermont biographers, and there were small, articles about Clarina Nichols, they talked about her as an advocate for married women's property rights, and then she went off to Kansas, and that was the end of the story. And then when I went out to Kansas to look for Clarina Nichols, they started with, she came to Kansas in 1854 and said very little about what she had done in Vermont. So that was really one of the goals of the project, was to put the two halves of this woman's career together. And in honor of the fact that we are very soon starting the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, I thought it would be only appropriate to talk to you about what she was doing in this pre-Civil War period. So, take yourself back now to March of 1861. 7 states have already seceded from the Union. The new president has just taken office. He's only been in office a month. What will he do? Will he keep the Union together? Will it shatter? Will he use force? And this is the situation they were in. So where was Clarina Nichols, the former lady editress of Brattleboro? And, oh dear, why is this? There she is. This is a portrait of her. It was actually a painting that was done based on an earlier daguerreotype from the late 1840s. So this is what we think she was pretty much looking like at the time that she was in Brattleboro. She was sitting in a dreary boarding house in Topeka, Kansas. And she had been, years earlier, well-known lady editress of Brattleboro, the champion of women's property rights. She had been the first woman to speak to the Vermont legislature, asking for votes for women in school meetings. She had stumped around the Northeast. She had damned many a man for drinking too much, her involvement in the temperance campaign, and she regaled her audiences with what she called the wrongs of womanhood. In 1854, she and 2 of her sons bravely went out to Kansas Territory. And here's what she wrote about that decision in her memoir. She recalled, "I thought I could accomplish much more for woman and with less effort in the new state of Kansas than I could in conservative old Vermont. So I guess things have changed a little bit in relationship between the two states, whose prejudices were so much stronger than its convictions. My husband went to Kansas for a milder climate, my sons to make homes, but I went to work for a government of equality, liberty, and fraternity. Well, if that isn't a politician, I don't know what is. The day after she arrived in Kansas, she writes back, "This is a new oasis of freedom." So you can see she was really enthusiastic about this process. So that was 1854. But by the eve of the Civil War, in 1861, here she was in this boarding house in Topeka, the new capital of a new state. She was very dispirited. The legislators were scrambling for power and out to cut each other's throat. And she wrote to a friend, "Oh dear, men are not as good as I wish they were." Rain was soaking the walls of this new building. The plaster was cracking. Then she became sick. She needed money. She wanted to return to Quindaro, the town in which she had established a home on the frontier. Things were not going well. So I'm going to tell you tonight about her adventures in Kansas and what had happened in these intervening years. Basically, Kansas transformed Clarina Nichols. She was a woman who came from a relatively conservative background. When she got to Kansas, she became a radical abolitionist and an advocate for universal suffrage, something that she didn't envision that she would be when she was still living in Brattleboro. I also want to point out that this story shows us the way in which anti-slavery and women's rights were entangled. Sometimes the two of them went together in a positive way, producing a lot of progress, but other times this pairing really got in the way of one or the other. So who was Clarina Nichols? I'm not going to go into her complete background. I think you're going to have to read the book to get that, because I've told that story a lot. But I want to talk a little bit about how she got into politics in Brattleboro. She married, her second husband was George Nichols, and he was editor of the Windham County Democrat in Brattleboro. Now, when they married, this was her second husband. The story of the first husband is in the book. And he was 58 years old, and she was 33. So this was a truly tested editor, an older man, a father figure for her, a guy who was going to help her get into politics. And here's another shot of him with their son. Now, she had 3 children by her first husband, Justin Carpenter. And this little boy was born in 1844. And so this is probably taken around 1847 in Brattleboro. And so that was her 4th and last child. The Democrat was a partisan newspaper. It was beholden to the Democratic Party. And so when she became increasingly more active, helping her husband and then becoming editor herself as he became ill, she got into politics, and she found that she loved it. She was very good at political debate, and she had started, of course, anonymously, because to be a woman and to write about party affairs was really an inappropriate thing for her to do. And so she had to start anonymously. She said, to get my readers used to my style, and then she eventually came out into her own name because people knew who was writing these columns. And I'll tell you why. It was partly because of the style. And I want to give you an example of that. First, let me show you this Windham County Democrat. This is on Elliott Street. There was a row of what's called the granite block on Elliott Street. And you can see the Vermont Phoenix in this woodcut. Later on, the Democrat was right next to the Vermont Phoenix, I think here, where it says carpets. But that was the building. And they lived on Green Street, which wasn't very far away, and she could just walk down to the Democrat office. And this will give you a little bit of an idea. You're probably familiar with this shot, any of you who have looked at the local history of Brattleboro before our time. Is that what it's called? I think it's in there. This is about 1850, and it shows you that Brattleboro was really a bustling place at this time. It was the heyday of the water cure. The water cure had just started. There were lots of visitors coming into town, and it was a commercial center of about 3,500 to 4,000 people. So Brattleboro was a pretty bustling, a good place for her to be operating a newspaper. And so here is how she portrayed herself. This comes from 1853. It isn't a woman's vocation to write politics, says one and another. Her sphere is at home. And we always say amen. Astonished are you, gentle reader? Did you think that Mrs. Nichols meddles with politics because she finds their details congenial with her taste? Or for any reason but that politics meddle with the happiness of home and its most sacred relations with woman and all that is sacred and dearest to a true woman? Well, as you can see, she was a very genteel lady, and she needed to portray herself that way in order to make sure that her listeners accepted her, even though sometimes she would write about radical ideas. She turned the paper into a reform journal, and she supported basically what we think of as the three prongs of antebellum reform: temperance, anti-slavery, and of course women's rights. She was a very witty and a somewhat sarcastic writer, and she became well known in the region for all of her dialogues, I'll call them, or debates with local editors who would sometimes challenge her ideas. And what she did was to argue with respect to women. She argued for equality for mothers. And that's why the subtitle of our book includes the term, The Politics of Motherhood. Clarina argued that women, because they are mothers, because their reproductive role is so important, they deserve equal rights with men. Now that was somewhat different than what some of the other early equal rights advocates were arguing, but this was the special way that she interpreted her charge. And I'll give you an example of what she said in her first and most famous speech. Is called The Responsibilities of Woman. And she gave it at the Second Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1851. And here's a quote from that speech. Next to God, woman is the creator of the race as it is and as it shall be. I ask then, has God created woman man's inferior? Of course not. That was her answer. Mothers needed access to property. And as you may know, when women married, their property was under the control of their husbands. That meant anything that they had inherited in terms of real estate, all of their earnings, and all of their possessions, which meant their clothing, their linens, their household goods were under their husband's control. And so she was arguing that in order for women to support children, they needed access to property. And they also needed, as she called, rights to babies. Men had complete guardianship over their children. And even if a man died, the children were then under the guardianship of his male relatives. And women would have to go to court in order to get guardianship of their own children. And this really drove her crazy. And so that was one of her really important arguments that she made in Vermont. So here she was at the height of her career in 1853. She had been tooling around, talking about temperance and women's rights all over the place. And in the middle of all this, she decides to uproot her family and go to Kansas. well, why did she make this decision? We know what she said about it, but there were other problems as well. First of all, she was really tired of the critics. She had been pilloried by a number of different people for her activities, and the clergy were getting quite annoyed by the women who were speaking out against for women's rights or temperance, and they were really innovative in the sense that women were not commonly expected to lecture to audiences of men and women. This was really a new thing. And one of her critics was a guy named Joseph Barrett. I'll just give you an example of the problem that she had faced. When she sent a petition to the Vermont legislature asking for the right to vote in school meetings, Barrett was a man who was head of the education committee. He was quite powerful in the legislature. He was also one of the editors that she had fought with already in the press. And he argued against her desire to address the body. They had to debate whether to hear a woman or not at this point in time. And he said, finally, he succumbed. If the lady wants to make herself ridiculous, let her come and make herself as ridiculous as possible and as soon as possible. But I don't believe in this scramble for the britches. And so you see, that's what they were saying, that these women were trying to wear the pants, so to speak. And of course, Clarina, being quite witty, came back at him and said that the gentlemen lawmakers had legislated our skirts into their possession. And of course, they had, because her skirts literally were in the possession of her husband. So she was frustrated with Vermont. The Vermont legislature did change the law regarding married women's property rights, but it was a very modest reform. They provided that a woman's property would not be attached by her husband's creditors. So, in other words, she did not have separate control, but the creditors couldn't take her property away. So it was a way of protecting the family, essentially. They were also allowed to make wills. They were allowed to control their property after they died. So she was still very concerned about the fact that they couldn't control their earnings. At the same time, she became involved in the free soil movement. And when I first got into this, I had no idea how important she had been in, as a journalist, spouting free soil rhetoric. Just to take you back of what was happening politically, in the late 1840s, the Democratic Party in the northern states began to split up because there were so many people who were opposed to slavery. And the Democratic Party, of course, was the party of slaveholders in the South. So Nichols became a voice for what we think of as a moderate anti-slavery position. At this point in time, she was not an abolitionist, at least not publicly. She couldn't really come out publicly as an abolitionist because she was running a Democratic paper. So that would have been a no-no. And at least in the 1840s, Brattleboro was not a site of a lot of anti-slavery activity, at least relative to other more active places in Vermont. And so she had to be quite careful. But Clarina had a very strong sense that slavery was wrong based on her Christian beliefs. She was raised as a Baptist in basically a Calvinist type church situation. And she had a very strong sense of humanitarianism, that she had sympathy for people, particularly for black slaves who were being degraded by the institution. She had what we think of as an evangelical sensibility, that she was an agent of God in the sense that she was going to redeem women from injustice as well as black slaves. At this point in time, free soil movement had been growing since the 1850s. And with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, which pretty much implicated Northerners in the institution of slavery, because it required people to return escaped slaves to the South. This was an example of those breeches that they complained about. This is Amelia Bloomer, and she was one of the first people to wear the Bloomer outfit, and of course it's named after her. And the women who wore these outfits, this is to show you the difference between the refined Mrs. Nichols and the more radical women's rights leaders. The women who wore these were actually trying to reform the dress code, but it played right into the fact that the critics were charging that they wanted to wear the pants, and as you can see, these are very daring looking pants. Okay, here we are. I wanted to explain the Kansas-Nebraska Act to you because this was the crucial turning point for Clarina. This is showing you the slave states and the free states in the North. And by the Missouri Compromise, the anything north of this southern border was supposed to be a free state. But when they passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, it provided that the first settlers, the first voters, would determine by what was called popular sovereignty whether slavery would be imposed in these two territories. So for Northerners, this seemed like a complete denial of the Missouri Compromise. And that really ignited a lot of people in the North about slavery. And it certainly got Clarina Nichols going as well. She had also an opportunity to go to the West prior to this to see what it was like. She went out to Wisconsin in 1853 because she was asked to give a series of lectures on temperance out there, and she loved it. She found there was a certain sort of social and political liberality, you know, that the West provided an openness that she was very encouraged by, and she actually thought that she could save the women of Wisconsin before she tried to save the women of Kansas. But when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, she decided that that would be a great opportunity to put her two favorite reforms together. And she and her two eldest sons, these are her carpenter children, her daughter Bercia, who did not go on this trip, and her two sons. This is Really and Chapin Howard. He was called Howard. They were 18 and 20, and they were anxious to get land. They had no inheritance because their father had, she had been divorced from him, and he had died by this point, and they needed opportunity, and they were anxious to go. And so she went with her two eldest sons, leaving her husband behind in Brattleboro. This was sort of a reversal of the normal pattern where the man goes out, makes the claim, and goes back to get the wife and the children. And they went with about 230 other people in a party organized by the New England Immigrant Aid Company. This was a land company that was organized in Massachusetts in order to promote this whole idea of free soil in Kansas, to make sure that Kansas remained a free state. So there was this scramble to get out to Kansas first, so you'd have enough voters to ensure that slavery wasn't imposed in the territory. Now, of course, the Southerners did the same thing. Many of the people from Missouri were anxious to make sure that it was a slave state. Her sons and Clarina traveled to Boston to catch up with this party. It was the fourth party that the New England Immigrant Aid Society had organized. And they left by rail from Boston, traveling to Detroit and then Chicago. From there down to St. Louis, where they caught a steamer to go up the Missouri River. And they landed at Kansas City, Missouri, and then hired wagons to take them 40 miles out to Lawrence. Now, Lawrence was the site of where this New England Immigrant Aid Company thought that they could establish a real Yankee stronghold. you know, a place where the New Englanders would have a hub. And Clarina tells a really great story about this whole process in her memoir, about what happened when she first arrived. And she says that her reputation preceded her. She drove up in this wagon. She gets out of the wagon, and there were a bunch of men in the office. And what were they doing? They were arguing about women's rights. And they wanted to hear Susan B. Anthony, or maybe Mrs. Nichols. And oh, there she was, right on the doorstep. So I don't know, the story is definitely representative, let's say that. And they demanded that she give a lecture. Well, she did actually give a lecture the next day. There she is. She's a little bit less demure than she was. This was probably about the time when she arrived in Kansas. And that's Brattleboro before she left, and this is what she came to. And this is Lawrence, where there were basically tents at this point in time. And they set up a tent for this church where she was going to give a lecture. So she writes about this, and she said, the audience sat a la Turk. Well, that meant they were sprawled on the floor. Now, you wouldn't do that in a New England meeting house. So this was quite something. And they were listening to a woman in the church. She was dedicating the church. Now, there were no women ministers at this point in time. They were sitting sprawled on the floor in a tent among bundles of prairie hay. I stood behind a desk made of 2 tool chests on top of each other, lighted with lanterns which lit up the faces of her listeners. It was such a novel scene, she remembered, that I enjoyed it as I have never done a lecture occasion. So I think it was really representative of what she thought she was going to find in the West, that this whole movement was going to create a utopia, you know, a place where women and blacks would really be free at last. And so Clarina becomes a propagandist for this whole Kansas project. She had made some contacts with various different editors in the East, and she began writing back stories about Kansas. And this was really a very political thing she was doing, because she was promoting Kansas as a place for other New Englanders to come, and of course to make sure that it was free soil. At the same time, she also argued very forcefully that women were a necessity in the West. She remarked that the women were all strong-minded. Well, that meant at that point in time that they were very outspoken. And in fact, a strong-minded woman was sort of a moniker that some of the critics had placed on women who got up and lectured, either about temperance or some other issue. But out there, she turned it into a really positive thing. And she said that the men who had wives out in Kansas were far better off. So she gets into an argument with this Missouri congressman, actually, Benjamin Stringfellow. He claimed that Kansas could not be settled without slave labor, and that the Yankees were all wimps, and that they were all going home. Well, Nichols shot back, saying, New Englanders came from very hardy stock, and some men had simply gone back for their wives. And she reminded Stringfellow, she said, God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helpmeet for him. And then she added, this was a wife, not a slave. Oh. Yeah. So she's really getting into it. And you can see through all this language, she is a very religious woman. It was appropriate for women to use religious language, but Clarina herself had a real sense of mission. Well, after 2 months, it was Clarina who went back home for her husband. And she gathered him and her younger son up, and they went back the following spring to Kansas. Meanwhile, Reilly and Howard were there, and they were scouting out property for them. They were unable to settle in Lawrence, where I think Clarina had thought she was going to settle. And they found a claim in Lane, was really just a four corners with a post office that was supposed to come pretty soon. And they were probably at about a mile or two from any other settlers at this point. So they were really isolated. And she hadn't quite anticipated that this was going to happen. And this is the kind of house they would have built, a mud house. And you can see it's quite different from what she was used to. Both she and Greeley began writing letters about this part of the experience back to the Brattleboro Phoenix. So the people in Brattleboro were really well informed about what was going on. And of course, Clarina downplayed all of the difficulties. She kept writing these glowing reports about how great Kansas was and how beautiful the prairie was. And she was actually pretty exhausted by this whole pioneer experience. But she joked. She joked about the lack of rooms in the cabin. And she said, "Ah, this simplifies housekeeping wonderfully. The chamber work is soon done, and parlors are dusted. Phew, how the wind does blow in the dust. And the table is soon cleared, not a morsel is allowed to be left, for we have no dishes for extra bits." And in fact, they were eating off the lids of tree trunks, apparently. So, now, really, his columns back were much more realistic. And he said, well, you have to live on mush and molasses for a week and sleep on a log for a fortnight before you can even get into a mud house. And I guess that is probably what they did. So, in the meantime, this was one aspect of their experience, but the other was that the politics was really causing trouble. And there was trouble between what became to be known as the Free State people and the pro-slavery advocates. The Missourians were streaming across the border to vote, and many of them, of course, were not going to stay. They were just going to vote and make sure that the territory was slave territory. So Nichols wrote about this, telling everybody in the Northeast about how these hordes of men had just come to vote, and describing them as armed with whiskey, drunken, and lawless. So the first election was basically fraudulent. Even the democratically appointed governor tried to get it to delegitimate it. In any case, other problems started to emerge. First, George, her husband, got sick. And then her young son was hit by a fence rail in an accident, and he suffered a concussion. And finally, in late August, George was now 70 years old. He became really ill, along with one of her sons, Howard. And they got what was called the ague, which a lot of people experienced. It was a form of malaria that really, you ran a fever and you were pretty much left prostrate for several weeks at a time, and not much work was able to be done. And she had to nurse them. And so things were not looking that great. Meanwhile, the political situation got worse, especially where they were. Now, this was an area where there were not just New Englanders. There were people from Tennessee, from Indiana, from Missouri, from Pennsylvania, and they were very different. They had different values, different ideas, and different ways of living. And she was feeling very isolated. Not only that, they were bringing slaves into the territory. The Kansas territory was filling up with lots of different people. And you can see here, even in this slide, there's a black slave in this family here. And so she hadn't lived in a slave society before. It was really a new experience. And the pro-slavery settlers who had won the election began threatening to shoot all of the Free State people. And they threatened to destroy Lawrence and to hang the news editors and to shoot the governor. And so the Free State people decided they needed some arms. And so they sent back to Massachusetts for some guns. And I don't know if you've heard of Beecher's Bibles, but this is when Beecher's Bibles were sent out. They were boxes of Sharps rifles that were sent out to the Free State people from Massachusetts. Henry Beecher was a minister who was involved in anti-slavery work. And there were labeled books or Bibles, I'm not sure which. And they were, these people were not supposed to be, most abolitionists were opposed to violence. And so this was really not something that they would normally expect to do, but they felt very threatened at this point in time. So Clarina was really beginning to despair about her agenda for women. Nothing was going to be happening in this situation that would improve women's rights. And so she decided to speak out. She resurrected a pseudonym that she had used in Brattleboro, a woman called Deborah Von Winkle. And she made up in order to disguise these sort of radical political ideas that she was trying to get across. Now, of course, she was a play on the country bumpkin, the Rip Van Winkle idea. She was a woman with quite practical knowledge, and she was hardworking, and she was certainly wiser than her man. So she wrote to the Herald of Freedom in Lawrence, which was the Free State newspaper, complaining that the anti-slavery men were ignoring women. Nobody out here knows anything about women's rights, she wrote. And she also noted, our rights will never be won and secured while slavery tramples upon our black sisters. So you can see at this point, she was really seeing that interconnection, that there was no way these two issues could be separated, and that both black and white women were under the yoke at this point. But part of the problem was that many of the settlers were not simply divided over slavery. The Free State men were divided themselves. Many of them cared very little about black freedom. They feared that wealthy slave owners would come in and control the territory. They also thought that they didn't want to compete against slave labor. They wanted it to be free white labor. And they were certainly not in favor of racial mixing. And so they thought Clarina Nichols and her friends, the abolitionists, were crazy. And not only that, they were haughty, and they were full of sort of empathy for blacks who they cared little about. And so they did not like the New Englanders and didn't want to be associated with the abolitionists. So one of these actually anti-slavery Missourians, someone who was against slavery, but who was certainly not wanting to be associated with abolitionists, responded to her letter. And he called himself Backwoodsman. He responded and said, "We claim no relationship to the African, and shall not recognize them as brothers until their sable skins become white and they comb their hair straight." Now that was a fairly common viewpoint at that point in time. By calling slaves Africans, they denied really that they were Americans, even though, of course, they were born here. And it was simply a way of ignoring their humanity. Well, at this point, here we are, August of 1855. She's gotten in this battle in the newspaper, and George Nichols died. So Clarina was really devastated at this point, and she became ill herself with the egg, and really had to nurse her at that point. But it wasn't long before she was back, because she needed to respond to Backwoodsman. And she told him about her Bible platform, as she called it, the broad platform of universal brotherhood. So in Aunt Debbie's voice, she said, "I take it for granted, Nabor, that you recognize the African as included among the subjects of gospel salvation and travelers to the same eternal home. If so, for I suppose you intend to go to heaven, ain't it wise to make up your mind to recognize them as brothers here? It won't look well there or be quite heavenly to pout, talk about skins and hair as title deed to a heavenly relationship, will it now, Nabor? It is well to remember that the grave and heaven are waiting for us all." So that was quintessential Clarina Nichols. You know, she really brought it home. Unfortunately, Backwoodsman had the last word, and I'll warn you again, this is language that really comes from the time and would not be really acceptable today. He reminded Aunt Debbie, when we all get to heaven, we'll all be white. So stop quarreling about the niggers and let's make Kansas a free white state. So that is actually what they did. The anti-slavery people voted in their first constitution to exclude all blacks from the territory. And Clarina, as you can see, was caught in a big fight. And that was the next slide here, was the Constitution Hall, where that first constitution was written in 1855. At that point, she was really worried, and she had a right to be, because things started heating up. There was a violence erupted in Lawrence, and Riley Carpenter decides to run off and defend the town. And he had a letter from Clarina in which she wrote that he is ready to shed his blood and die in defense of the town. She wrote to the Eastern papers as well. Sharp's rifles are in all our cabins, and Kansas freedom sworn upon all our domestic altars. And so you can see that this experience was really transforming this woman. I mean, she had expressed a pacifist sort of sensibility prior to this, but she was ready to defend the project out there. Well, there was a standoff in Lawrence at this point, and Clarina comes back to Brattleboro. She had to settle her husband's estate, which was one reason. I think she was really exhausted. That was the second reason that she needed to leave for a period of time. And this is where she got even more involved in partisan politics than you might imagine. When she began giving speeches, and she helped raise money for the people in Kansas. And things got worse because in May of 1856, Lawrence was attacked by the pro-slavery people, and it was burned to the ground. And the press that she had written for was thrown into the river. And so Clarina had planned to return to Kansas, but she was prevented from doing so because the pro-slavery people blocked the river, and so no supplies could get in, and immigrants couldn't get out there as well. And so she began going around and trying to raise money for the Kansas immigrants. Then really decides to join John Brown. And John Brown at this point was notorious because he had gone in and killed a bunch of supposedly innocent people in what's called the Potawatomi Massacre. He was trying to defend the Free State people because the pro-slavery advocates were coming in and burning their settlements and pillaging and so forth. And so Brown is out there trying to defend the territory. Really was wounded in the Battle of Blackjack in June of 1856. And you can imagine how Clarina was feeling at this point. She's trapped back in the East. Her son is wounded. And what does she do? She starts carrying that bullet, supposedly. Now, I don't know how she got the bullet. She says she had the bullet. Around the Northeast, trying to raise money for the Kansas immigrants. And she got involved in Republican politics. In 1856, John C. Fremont was the first presidential candidate for the Republican Party. And Horace Greeley invited Clarina to campaign for Kansas. Now, the party platform was all about free soil and Kansas. And so she could go out, talk about Kansas, say she was the mother of Kansas, talking about this project, but she was showing up at political rallies. She was showing up at men's caucuses. And women just didn't do that sort of thing. It was the first, actually she was one of the first people who did this kind of campaigning for any party at all. And she went really here from the wrongs of womanhood to the wrongs of Kansas. It was quite a novelty, but she pretended she was just doing sort of a little political work on the side. My sons are among the sufferers and the defenders of the ill-fated territory, she said. Their blood has baptized the soil which they yet live to weep over, to love, and to defend. And so she really became quite well known in this whole campaign. As you know, Fremont did not win that election. And meanwhile, the next spring, she goes back to Kansas. And I'm going to close up here because I'm running on too long. But she returned to Kansas and she settled in a little town called Quindaro, which was much closer to the center of activity, and it was filled with a lot of other New Englanders and abolitionists, and she became enamored of Quindaro. She wrote for a Free State newspaper, then she collaborated with abolitionists. She protected escaped slaves in her house. She operated with her daughter, who went with her this last time, an integrated school for a while, and she continued to juggle these two things, black freedom and women's freedom. And her most famous activity was her appearance at the Kansas Constitutional Convention in 1859. And this is after the Republicans gained power. The slavery issue had basically been resolved. And they were writing the Constitution, which now exists in Kansas as their state constitution. And once again, she was asked to speak in front of the lawmakers. After she did so, the New York Times reporter wrote, "The strong-minded females of Kansas have deliberately assaulted the new Constitutional Convention, and they demand a full and free recognition of their female human rights." And so, you know, she actually became most well known for that appearance. Well, the Republicans were in control, but women's suffrage was not exactly their priority. She had come to the convention hoping to present a universal suffrage platform, both women and black suffrage. But she knew that either one would kill off the other. And so she decided that the only way she could go forward was to detach women's suffrage from black suffrage. And that's exactly what she did. In the long run, she only got what we know of as school suffrage, a right in the Kansas Constitution that guarantees equal rights for women in school affairs. But she was the person who wrote that clause, and probably the first woman to write a clause in the state constitution at this time. She called it basically the entering wedge of full citizenship, even though the women in the East were not really promoting school suffrage per se. They thought it was half a loaf, you know, let's go for the whole thing. But still, in 1861, she was still trying to get this encoded in Kansas law, along with the legal rights that she was helpful in promoting out there. It was not all uphill from there. In fact, it was basically, you know, very little additional progress was made after that appearance, and the Civil War intervened. So I think I should stop and have questions.
What is school suffrage?
What is school suffrage? Voting in school meetings. You know, every year we have a town meeting, and part of that is usually, I don't know if they do that still in Brattleboro, a school meeting where you vote on the school directors.
I see.
Yeah, and it was considered semi-appropriate for women because of the connection between mothers and children.
So she actually won that for Kansas?
For Kansas, yeah. And it was the first state to do that. That was in 1859, and most states did not pass that till the 1880s. Vermont passed it in 1880. Yeah. It's time that the federal government had hired women for office work. And so she went to Washington to live with her daughter, and she got a job in the Quartermaster General's office. And then she became the matron of a home for black contrabands, women and orphans who had come to Washington for safe haven. and they started a home for them. And during that period, she came back to Vermont to raise money, actually, for the home. So, yeah, all of them. But she then returned to Kansas in 1866 after her time as matron was over. Yeah.
So you were a co-author on this book. How did you manage, how did you define the responsibilities of writing?
My co-author was Kristen Ortell, and when I had been working on Nichols for quite some time. This is actually from 1864 during the war period. That was one of the last good portraits we have of her. I had been working on her for quite a while, and I got this phone call from Kristen Ortell, and she had just completed her dissertation on Bleeding Kansas. And she said, well, are you going to write a biography of Nichols? And I said, yeah, I think I am. And she said, okay, well, I was thinking of doing it, but I won't do it. And so I said, well, let's do it together, because that seemed logical. She knew a lot about Kansas, and I hadn't gotten deeply into that story yet. So we basically divided the book. I wrote the first Vermont half of it, and she drafted the two main Kansas chapters, and then I did the remaining. And then, of course, we edited each other's work, and it worked pretty well because we were on the same wavelength in terms of her interpretation, and also, our writing style wasn't that different. So, but a lot of people ask that question because it is sometimes very hard for authors to do that, but it worked out pretty well. And Kristen was very, it was really great to have, I like working that way with another person. It was very good. Yeah.
What was Nichols' relationship with Susan B. Anthony?
She had a very interesting relationship with Anthony. She met her in 1852 when she was deeply involved in the Eastern movement. And then she sort of lost track of her when she went to Kansas. But they started up a correspondence during the Kansas Constitutional Convention. And because she was getting some money from the Eastern people to help pay for her expenses. And advice from Anthony. And for the rest of her life, they corresponded on and off. And they had quite a close relationship based on that. And Anthony felt that Clarina was a very good speaker. And during the early years, she asked Clarina to come and speak because she was so appealing to the audiences. She wasn't radical, she was selling respectability. And it was helpful to this radical movement to have a respectable woman, a very ladylike woman, stand up. She got along quite well. She did not know Elizabeth Cady Stanton very well. And in fact, they sort of got into a fight over a divorce issue. Stanton was in favor of a liberal divorce law, and Clarina was not, and there's sort of confrontation over there. That's a whole other story. But she did know all of the women and was deeply involved in that movement.
There was a connection with her. She grew up in Townsend, Vermont, as I understand
Yes.
it. Because I think there's a chapter in the Townsend town history on her.
Yes, there is. Right. She was born in West Townsend, Vermont, and her family was Chapin, and she was the daughter of Chapin and Bercia Howard, and he was a fairly prominent man in town, entrepreneurial. So she grew up in a pretty relatively privileged household, I would say. Very, very deeply schooled in Baptist belief. He was an elder in the church, and she held on to her religion for a lot longer than most of the other women's rights leaders. Yeah.
What kind of education did she have?
She really didn't have a lot of extended education. She had one term in a secondary school. Otherwise, it was elementary. But it was not uncommon to be self-taught in those days, and I think there were a lot of, not a lot, but there was a number of people in West Townsend who cared deeply about education, and there were some men who I think were helpful to her in helping to school her. She was certainly well read, and she claimed later that she was basically self-taught. But she had less education than most of the other women in the movement. They had gone to seminaries, and she didn't. So, considering that she didn't have any formal education, she was a very good writer. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about her and John Brown, and I'm just wondering what happened to that relationship once Brown moved kind of away from defending Kansas, trying to stop bleeding Kansas, and moved to taking war to the South, cuts there off the roots, so to speak.
Yeah. Some people have asked me if she ever wrote anything about Brown or said anything about Brown, and I just wish she had, but she didn't. But at one point, at the time of Harper's Ferry, she was actually across the river in Missouri trying to lecture, and at that very night of Harper's Ferry. And she was in a boarding house waiting to go out and lecture, and the boarding house woman said, "You better stay right here," because there were riots all over the place, and she was a known abolitionist by that point. And so, but, you know, I thought at that point she would have said something about Brown, but unfortunately not. And he's a very interesting character. If you go out to Kansas, there's a whole industry of brown people out there who research him. So, yeah.
What kind of sources did you use to?
Good question. It was hard because there were really very, very few personal letters, and we had to use her public writings mostly, so the newspapers that she wrote in and her speeches, and we had to sort of read between the lines to figure out a lot of this stuff, because there's probably, you know, a handful of personal letters. There's one really great letter to Susan B. Anthony, and that's really about it for meaty stuff. And so that made it quite difficult. And also, as Jerry was, he was looking to see whether the library had the Windham County Democrat. There's very few copies of it left. There's probably about 10 or 12 on a microfilm, and then they're scattered all over the place. I had to read other newspapers to see what they were saying about her, yeah, it was very hard to find good sources for this project. And most biographers have a whole, you know, cache of personal letters, and so we had to sort of figure out, well, what did she think about her mother? She never mentions her mother. We know that she revered her father. She admired him a lot. She hardly ever mentions her mother. And hard to say. That's a 3-year-old shot of her. And these are all in the book. And it shows you something about the sort of upward mobility of her family, that they would have a portrait painted. Here it is. It's 1813 in West Townsend. You know, it's not exactly like a bustling place.
Who's the artist?
We don't know. We don't know who the artist. Probably an itinerant. Yeah. Because there were itinerant artists that went around. But for her father to hire an artist, you know, to paint this thing. And this is her father, Chapin. Very, you know, Baptist elder, but a very highly regarded figure in town. Selectman, overseer of the poor, representative to the legislature, and she really admired him tremendously, and she got a lot. You know, she became a politician because he was a politician essentially, and her brother was also a representative in the legislature.
How many people live in this?
That's her mother. Clarina says she was progressive and ambitious. It's the only quote. Now, yeah.
That's fascinating, though. I was thinking maybe she was just, you know, very, churchy and didn't approve of things, but she maybe not at all.
She approved of doing well, and progressive and ambitious, I think, meant, you know, Clarina was the eldest of 8 children, so making her daughter ready for marriage and, you know, well skilled in domestic skills and educated. She cared about Clarina's education, definitely. So, but she was a very religious woman too. And that's the Baptist church in West Townsend that they helped to build.
That's still there?
Yes, it's not Baptist anymore, it's a Christian Bible church.
It's set back from the road when you go to West Hampton, it's back.
And this is Clarina at age 16. See, she's ready for marriage. Now remember, it's a portrait. It's highly stylized. But it's a very tiny miniature. It's on ivory. But you see what they aspired to, you know. And that was her first husband, Justin Carpenter, who was a snake, spent all her money, and but he was, you know, he was what? He was yeah, very handsome. Yeah.
He was
Yes.
Guilford.
How
Guilford.
did she divorce? I didn't think you could divorce back then.
Yeah, you hardly could. What happened was that he was unable to support them. He had pretensions to grandeur, I think. You know, he was an entrepreneur, but he didn't do well. Everything failed. They ended up in New York City, and she had to support the family. So she had to go and take in sewing and take in boarders, and it was devastating to her. So at one point, and we don't know anything about him either, which drove us crazy. Luckily, we found, this is at the Cincinnati Art Museum, and we found this in the middle of the project, actually. She says, in an anonymous story, she says, he, from a malevolent desire to wound her, stole the children. So we feel that he must have been abusive in some way, either psychological, we don't know if it was physical, but he was unhappy. And at that point, she came back to Townsend they recovered the children. She told her family, and she, you know, was in a pickle at that point because he still controlled all her property and her children. So in order for her to get free of him, she had to get a divorce. So what did they do? They changed the law. And this was a formidable event and an important experience for her. Vermont law was a little bit more liberal than other states because it allowed for cruelty. Most states just allowed only for the adultery plea, which was, you know, very difficult to prove. And so they pled cruelty. And but Vermont law, the law stated that the cause of the separation had to occur in the state, and it didn't. It occurred in New York. So Chapin gets the local legislator to write a bill changing the law, which they did, and she had to send testimony to the court, which was just terribly shameful for her, and so. She had to wait, though, 3 years because they changed the law, but they instituted a waiting period before she could marry.
Did you change the law in New York?
No, in Vermont, yeah.
Did you have access to the testimony?
Pardon?
Did you have access to the testimony?
No, I looked. No, it would have been 1840, and those legislative records do not exist. Yeah.
The legislature had to grant a divorce? Or?
Yeah. Oh, no, they were changing the law.
They changed the law, but then
Yeah.
the court.
The Supreme Court granted divorces. It was a
So
roving court.
So would there be papers in the Supreme Court or not?
Yes, her divorce paper is in the court,
Yeah,
but not the testimony for that
Yeah.
either.
Do you know where it was granted? Was it granted in Newfane or?
Yeah, and it's in the Newfane court house. Yeah. This is from 1832 when she was living in New York with her husband, her first husband. So you can see they were living a high style, or at least pretending to live a high style. And it doesn't even look like her, I agree. But it's in the family. We got it from the descendants. So we think it's her.
Great eyes.
This is the Chapin Howard's house in Townsend on the Green. This is where she came back to. This is not her childhood house because she grew up in West Townsend, but he moved to Townsend Village during her marriage. And he, by that point, was, you know, she comes back to Townsend. Here she is with a failed marriage and 3 children, and he's the most prominent man in town. So it was pretty difficult. He had helped start Leyland and Grace Seminary. He was, leader in the church and all of this stuff. And that is the house where they were living. This is the one from 1864. And I want to show you the last one. Oh, this is Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now this is later, in the late 19th century. She continued to communicate with them when she went here to California. And that's where she died, in Potter Valley, California. So she kind of comes back. This is a beautiful spot. It looks about like this today. It's gorgeous. And she's buried out there in Potter Valley, which is pretty close to Ukiah in Northern California. And what you all should know, if you go out there, is there's a museum called the Grace Hudson Museum in Ukiah, and it was started with paintings that her granddaughter did. And there's a large display all about Clarina Nichols.
I was there, and I knew, as they kept telling me about this person, and I never put it together that that's who it was.
Yes.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
I didn't go because I didn't get I was there for about 24 hours.
Her granddaughter was a painter of the Pomo Indians out there, and they're wonderful, wonderful paintings. And she followed her son, really, who, in the middle of Bleeding Kansas, after he had fought in the battles, he decides to go west with a bunch of abolitionists and get out of there. And so they go to this beautiful spot in California. And then in 1872, she followed him out there with her youngest son, George. And he married an Indian woman, a Wyandot from Kansas. And so she had Indian grandchildren that she raised because their mother died. And she basically educated them in the final years of her life. So she had a really interesting life, not the typical New England story.
Thank you very much.